In many ways, no, there is plenty of time. I won't get into this. Dan wants to say, have the last word. Go ahead.
Nothing substantive. I just wanted to talk about the structure for the second panel. Because, we're going to have a break, but the break is really going to consist in what we have on the video monitors. We're playing 2 short animated clips, and while people help themselves to refreshments and speak calmly with the panel, there'll be a program running, and then when the second panel assembles, we can, people who want to comment on the film can do that. Otherwise, just pay attention to what the panelists themselves say. So let Manthia close off and proceed to the second part of the program.
Well, it is closed, and I'd like to thank a brilliant.
Pas beaucoup participé, mais quand on arrive la première fois dans un pays, il y a d'abord une capacité d'écoute.
So I have not participated much in the conference, but I understand wisdom states that when you go to a country for the first time, you should increase your capacity of listening.
Donc, c'est vrai que je parle pas l'anglais.
I do not speak English.
Mais j'ai beaucoup senti des vibrations.
So I felt the vibes, you know.
Ce qui m'amène à dire
Which leads me to say
que par rapport à mon introduction de tradition,
so in his introduction to tradition, well, let him finish this French.
Donc Fadika vient de dire que l'Afrique c'est un continent multiple, traditionnellement parlant et tout. Je vois bien que justement cette différence de langue française et anglaise, c'est-à-dire que même en Afrique, soit on s'exprime en anglais ou en français. Donc ça m'amène à vous parler justement du système de légitimité moderne par rapport à ce système de légitimité traditionnelle pour vous introduire à voir le film Aramouya que je sais qui n'a pas encore passé.
Okay. So Fadika Kramo Lansine had just stated that Africa is a huge continent and which is often divided between Anglophone and Francophone as in a way official languages, and his film, as a matter of fact, which has not passed yet, and it puts into play the legitimacy of these official languages and traditional languages or cultures.
Tout ce que nous disons, c'est très important. Ce qui est important, justement, comme il a su bien le souligner, par rapport à mon film, je vais vous présenter une Afrique moderne. Je vais vous présenter la cité africaine.
So what is important to him is to present to you in his film a modern Africa, an African urban setting in Africa.
Qui n'est pas certes différente d'une cité dans le monde entier.
Which is not different from urban settings.
Mais qui a sa spécificité d'être africain.
But which has its specificity of being African and Burkinabe.
Et à partir de la vision de ce film, nous pourrons mieux discuter et je serai à votre disposition pour encore le rendez-vous du donner et de recevoir.
So after the film, we can discuss more about this and also the give and take, that is the human condition.
Merci.
Thank you.
Okay.
So,
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Webster, and I work with the African Film Festival. And in conjunction with the Department of Africana Studies at NYU, we've organized these 2 panel discussions today. I'd like to begin by thanking Manthia Diawara, who put the resources of his department and the Institute of African American Studies at NYU at our disposal, and he really deserves a hand of applause because not only wouldn't this panel be possible, but the whole festival really wouldn't be possible without his patronage and his support. So could we just, acknowledge the Department of Africana Studies and Manthia Diawara. With this second panel, the format is basically going to proceed the same way we did earlier this morning. I'm simply going to introduce the panelists, and then we'll go down the row, and panelists will speak for around 10 or 15 minutes each, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Clyde Taylor is a visiting professor with the Department of Africana Studies at NYU. I believe he has a post at Tufts University in Boston, and he'll be our first speaker and sort of act as an impromptu moderator if we need him. Jacquie Jones is hails to us from Boston right now. I believe she was in D.C. for a while before then, right? And she works with WGBI in Boston, which is a public radio, public television. Ken Jones is with Scholastic Magazine. He's a writer, a performance artist, filmmaker as well. Cheryl Chisholm is coming to us from Atlanta. She is a film programmer, an educator, filmmaker as well. Rob Nixon is with the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, and he has recently written a book on popular culture in South Africa and the anti-apartheid struggle there. And Reggie Woolery is from here in New York, originally from Detroit, I've learned, and he also teaches on the faculty at NYU in the cinema school. Television. And we hope you enjoy the program, and we'll proceed with Clyde and go move to his right.
Thank you, Don. When I look at the topic of placing African American popular culture in relation to African cinema, I see it as a temptation to put both of those themes on a carpet along with some other questions having to do with, let us say, modernity in both African and African American contexts, and with what I think of as a cultural Pan-Africanism. I mean, I cannot avoid that opportunity to look at that question that way. And one of the first observations that occurs to me is how African cinema has inserted itself into a sort of a black world cultural context in recent years. And my way of accessing that notion is to remind myself that the first international festival of Negro art in 1966 was perhaps, by the way, the venue in which the notion of black world culture was announced. I'm not trying to impose a history, but I suspect that was one of the first occasions where that notion arose. And at that point, African cinema was just a baby. African cinema consisted, at that festival, primarily of Ousmane Sembène's first feature film, Black Girl, which was, of course, the first sub-Saharan feature film in existence. So here you have, in many ways, a double, triple birth, so to speak. But on that occasion, as I said, African cinema was just barely on the horizon compared to the presence of the the novelists and the musicians and the painters and the rest who were very much well in place in the notion of a black world cultural format. Now, today, when you look at a black world creativity, you may think in terms of, say, a kind of a black world literacy. You may think in terms of Derek Walcott and Wole Soyinka and Toni Morrison, who have won the Nobel Prize, and other internationally famous and wonderful artists, Bob Marley and Youssou N'Dour and whoever. But you will also have to include Ousmane Sembène and Souleymane Cissé, I would think, and Julie Dash and maybe Spike Lee in this sort of global mix. So we're looking now at an African cinema which has become part of a larger black world cultural mix. And so I want to look at some of the possibilities of examining what that scene looks like and how African American popular culture might interface with African cinema. And the first observation I have is that there is not that much of an interaction that I can see. One moment that does stand out in my mind as a moment of African American popular culture and African society intersecting is in Sembène's film Camp de Traoré, where you have two sergeants, one from Senegal, a Senegalese sergeant, and an African-American sergeant, and they're meeting at first in hostile circumstances. They're angry with each other, but then they get to talking about music and jazz in the barracks, and the Senegalese sergeant plays, I can't remember if it's Charlie Parker or Lester Young, but they begin to have a very warm relation around that moment. And of course, that is a particular contribution of Simben's sensibility, because Simben, with his acute sensitivity of political issues and internationalism, understands the need for reaching beyond one's local neighborhood, so to speak, in considering the issues that are involved. Simben, who, for instance, very quickly acknowledges the inspiration of Paul Robeson on his development. I also think, in terms of exchanges, on a kind of a lighter personal note, I think of a cross-linguistic exchange I had at the first International Latin American Film Festival in Havana. I went to Thomas Alea's house, and people were speaking Spanish, and I couldn't speak any Spanish. And there was this brother there who I had seen in several films. He played these heroic roles. He was a grand king of these films and a major star in these films. In the daytime, he was a truck driver for the Film Institute, and that was some of the curious kind of social dynamics of Cuba at that time. But I wanted to talk with him, and we couldn't talk. He didn't have any English, I didn't have any Spanish, but the music caught us going, and so at one point he said something about Nina Simone. I said, Nina Simone. And then I said, Lester Young. He said, Lester Young, whoa. And so we went on like that for about 20 minutes, you know. Dexter Gordon, yeah, you know Dexter. And so we just embraced around these icons, these sonic icons, you might call them. But one of the interesting things about it, as I think about it, as we named the names, we also heard the music behind the names, you know. So there have been these moments of various interchange, but for the most part, I don't think I see a lot of influence of African American popular culture in African films. Cartier Mozart is one film that accesses Spike Lee's sensibility and some of that musical hip hop feeling, and also MTV technique. But I think it's not entirely exceptional. It is not so frequent a thing, and I'm thinking about that, and it seems to me that what's happening is that African cinema is reflecting the jobs that African filmmakers feel are necessary more so than to make that kind of connection. What I think I see happening is many films, not all of them, but many films dealing with a classical African past, and in that way they're saying more about modernity than perhaps films that are right up to date, because by the way they historicize both the past and the present, they make us realize what our relationship to modernity is and make us find paths towards our own modernities, either African or African American, a little bit more abruptly. So I'm looking at these films as an occasion really to understand what's happening with the cultural Pan-Africanism that I think started perhaps in 1966, but is really a phenomenon of the post-Second World War era. And from that point on, it seems to me that, and of course, Pan-Africanism itself starts from before the Second World War as a political function, but as a cultural function has been percolating in the last half century and will continue to go on. But do we have a way of thinking about this cultural Pan-Africanism? Can we see how it can operate as a kind of polyrhythmic cultural development, where we don't necessarily look at one culture and see how the other culture is matching that, but understand that there are different rhythmic paces going on, different rhythmic movements going on, different access toward modernities going on, which together may make a very rich palette, and from which many people can draw and learn something, but which can also be the scene of some very narrow and I think pathetic comparisons and misunderstandings. One of the features, it seems to me, of this polyrhythmic cultural development and cultural interpretation that I'd like to see us moving to, one of the features of it might be that we might have to learn to tolerate a lot of boo-boos, misconceptions, miscues, or distortions, or maybe I haven't found the right word, dropping the wrong accent when, for instance, one culture represents the other, because more and more we are doing that. I think, for instance, of the quote that Maurice Condé gave to Medhando's film, West Indies. She says, "Indeed, West Indies is no more a West Indian film than it is an African film." And then she goes on to say that it's a film about the oppression of people. But Medhando's film, West Indies, uses the title, he uses West Indies as a metaphor. One from the West Indies might say, well, that's not the West Indies I know, but I think that that kind of cross-cultural representation is going to take place without the literacy, without the literal accuracy or authenticity that one might expect from within one's community. I think of Kafka's America, for instance. It has no, whatever resemblance it has to anybody's real America is totally nightmarish and fictional. But it's still a work that I'm very glad that Kafka wrote. Or Duke Ellington's Jungle Music. There's a kind of self-irony there going on, but there's something that can be learned about Ellington's relationship to African musical culture at the same time. So I think that one of the worst notions that we could develop is a notion of cultural purity, that at least a cultural purity that prohibited some of the exchanges that are bound to take place across some of the national borders and even regional borders within the black world cultural context. I'm not trying to excuse the film as dumb and as vicious as Coming to America, for instance, but at the same time, I think that we have to accept that there's going to be a certain amount of slack, a certain amount of misappropriation in this arena as in other ones. I think that I've seen a lot of critiques and counter-critiques around the, within the arena, let me say, of Pan-African expression, which are, I think, pathetic examples of what I might call transatlantic tribalism, which is just another extension of other kinds of tribalism. And I've seen all kinds of people clothing themselves rather closely into their own particular cultural backgrounds. But for me, it is very clear that the Pan-African notion is one that is a very sensible idea, that it is there even when we are being rather shallow, as human beings can often be, that idea is a profound idea which permeates much of our history in the 20th century and will permeate more of it in the 21st century, essentially because it is a fundamentally humanist idea. It is a humanist idea, and that's where it gets its value from. So even though we may not want to be bothered with it, it will be there, and it will lead us, and I think, into some of our better developments in the century to come. Thank you.
Going to go and what the idea for the panel was, and he sort of suggested to me that it maybe be a good idea to talk about how African American popular culture is a way for African American audiences to access African cinema, and that, you know, somehow was there a way to prepare African American audiences for the experience, and I began to think about that, and I thought, you know, there's a way that we talk about the aesthetics of African cinema, and that, you know, the more deliberate pacing, different sorts of uses of natural imagery as opposed to what's a popular kind of Hollywood thing. And that's the way we normally talk about sort of the interface between African American culture and cinema and African cinema. But that I began to think that there's another way to sort of look at where the intersections are between the two, and that way maybe was to look at what the narrative needs of both audiences are. And I should say, before I say any more, that for the last 6 months I've been working very diligently on a project about slavery and trying to basically distill 50 years of American history into a 90-minute film. And so it's very difficult for me to think about anything apart from slavery. So that's part of what I want to say, that in African cinema, particularly in the first African films that I saw, the epics like Yaleen and Saraunia, that there was this idea of returning to the ancient past as a way to understand the present, which Clyde just alluded to, but that generally these films, stayed in the ancient past and missed the experience of slavery and missed the experience of colonization. And recently, last week, I saw Qaeda, which I thought was a really fascinating film in that it was situated in the present, but it made the same return to the ancient past as a way to really link the experience, the modern African experience with an ancient African experience, and also to situate, to restore in a certain sense African history to its rightful place. But again, it went back to ancient times and then jumped to the present and again missed the experience of slavery and the experience of colonization. And I think for American audiences for African American audiences, that there is a need to fill in that space, that because the experience of slavery is really central to the idea of an African American experience, and basically without the experience of slavery there would be no African American experience, that there is a need to, on the one hand, sort of have a public acknowledgement of the fact that, African American people have been tortured, and persecuted in a sense. But at the same time, there's a need to distance oneself from any kind of identity that's originating in the experience of a victim. So I think it's often like with Afrocentrism and with the desire of African Americans to make the bridge to African culture and the African experience, that there's a desire to sort of find a kind of embrace, from African cultural expressions that really hasn't been there, in a lot of ways. And so, and I think it's really apparent in the reception of a film like Haile Gerima's Sankofa, which, a lot of people had issues with technically and filmically, but audiences really, really responded to. And I first saw the film in Ouagadougou, and the response of the audience was really phenomenal to that film, I thought, particularly since it was an African audience. And then when you see the film again with an American audience, the level of the response is basically the same. And it is like the moment, I think, in terms of the histories where there is a bridge there. Both culturally and historically. And it allows, I think, or it could allow for a better kind of understanding between the two cultures. I think that one of the things that that I understood Clyde to be talking about just now in terms of appropriating certain other cultures or using one culture to stand in for another or taking parts of Africanism, it's like the kente cloth thing, as opposed to having any real substantive involvement with contemporary African history or contemporary African politics, that a way maybe to deal with that is to have a dialogue that does begin with the historical experiences of both people. So I think that that's what I was thinking about in terms of sort of where the two meet and what the possibilities are in terms of exploring a cinematic relationship. So I think that's it.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Don and I would like to thank Mayhan for my inclusion on this panel. In addition to what Don said, I'm an author. My second book, A Choice of Colors, The History of African American Filmmakers, is going to be published this fall by the Millbrook Press. And I would just like to share one discussion I had while I was working on that book with Clayton Riley. We were talking about Hattie McDaniel and Louise Beaver and Lincoln Perry stepping fetching. And I remember what Clayton said, you must understand that there is something that's very African about these people. You could take Hattie McDaniel's face and hold it up next to a mask. There is an exquisite beauty. Hattie McDaniel was an African. Then we talked about Sidney Poitier. Sidney Poitier is an African. And in terms of the link between African-American popular culture as a bridge to African cinema, I believe, based on my travels and my experiences as a journalist and as Malcolm X would just say, as a black man, that the seeds are there. I think what it is incumbent for filmmakers, artists, students in particular, intellectuals to do is to point out our commonalities. If, you know, Clyde talks about polyrhythmic Pan-Africanism, it exists already. I like share a few situations with you. Years ago, I interviewed Tevin Campbell. I was very fascinated and captivated with Tevin Campbell. I'm like, this is the singingest little boy since Michael Jackson. So anyway, what I really wanted to talk to Tevin about was a song he had done on Quincy Jones's Back on the Block. And I think it's the opening cut, and like, he talks about this like boy named Stokey. Stokey's just Stokey, mama, you know. He kissed the girls and make them cry. And then he goes into Swahili. So I said, Tevin, yo man, do you know what the Swahili means? He said, no. I never thought about it like that. I'm like, so you don't know what it means in Swahili? I'm like, Tevin, you know, I'm not going to write that, like, you know, you do not understand the translation of the lyrics. He said, but all I knew was it was happening. It was dope. It was funky. And Quincy Jones said to sing it. So what stood out for me was how good Tevin sounded singing this. You know, I mean, and the way he sang it, I could just see the whole scene unfold. I think it's important that we understand and we draw attention to the Africanness which exists in all of us. Another case in point, I'm from Detroit like my brother Reginald here.
That's a good thing.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. And 2 years ago, I was at a, every year Aretha Franklin gives this scholarship dinner. Nobody, you might see something in Jet Picture of the Week. Basically, she gets all her friends to come in. So Aretha had Shaka Khan there. And Aretha and Shaka Khan, I went back into the, I was going to interview Aretha. And she and Shaka Khan are sitting on this couch. I'm like, these are two African women. You could put them in Chitenge. There were expressions that they were making. You know, I'm not necessarily sure how much of an African Shaka Khan thinks she is, you know, and I mean, that's not to detract from her. But the fact of the matter is, and Miriam Makeba said this, well, everybody's not going to come out, you know, singing traditional African songs bare feet. Okay? And once again, I mean, these are two African women sitting and talking. A few days ago, and then I'm going to make some other points and talk about African film, I said to a friend of mine, Angelique Kidjo was in town. Who's Angelique Kidjo? I said, you don't know who Angelique Kidjo is? From Benin? You don't know Angelique? She's like, no, why don't you just shut up and inform me, you know, a little bit of who Angelique is. So I was trying to describe Angelique's music, and I was trying to describe her visually. And finally I said, you know what she is? Angelique, she's a combination of Grace Jones and Tina Turner with a short afro. And to me, once again, there was a bridge. There was a link. I said, she is a contemporary pop African singer. And I think in terms of looking at modernity and polyrhythmic, I mean, it's all around us. All you have to do is turn on the television on Sunday. And there's, you can see the big three. You can see Scottie Pippen, you can see Michael Jordan, and you can even see our brother Dennis Rodman. The things that those men do on the field or on the basketball court, you don't see a lot of people doing them. So once again, I think in terms of what's embedded in our subconsciousness, the seeds are there. I mean, when like you see little boys on the playground talk about, I'm Hakeem on you, and somebody else says, I'm Jordan, and you look at these motions and the images that they're going through. Now, to go over to the other side of the water, when I taught at the African Literature Center in Kitwe, Zambia, and I had students from all over the continent. It was a Pan-African experience. It was a learning experience for me. The young boys on my campus, like the sons of my colleagues, they would bug me. Mr. Jones, do you know LL Cool J? No, I don't. But he is an American. Yes. And you are an American. Yes, I am. So then why don't you know him? How can you not know him? Would you like to hear me do LL Cool J? And I mean, you know, these kids, I mean, they were great. You know, so there was almost a purity of African subconsciousness, but with the young Africans, I thought that it was much more conscious, as opposed to their counterparts, at least here in the United States. And I was absolutely fascinated. So then, I think one of the things that, in some ways, African film is more liberated than American films, and this is with great qualification, I do not say this naively, is that there are values that I see espoused in African films. For example, I think one of the greatest films of all time was The Golden Ball. You know, it's like you could take your whole family to see it. But if I'm going to try to take my family to see, let's say, Pocahontas, or they won't go to see The Adventures of Tom and Huck, the things that are in the canons, you know, the classics, because we have stories that exemplify our own lives, and that little boy in The Golden Ball could have been any boy in The Golden Ball. The Sacred Tree and Wati, those are all seeds that are already sown, that are already pregnant within us. And I think particularly the real challenge becomes, how do we build the bridge? And one of the ways I think is, Sly talks about I am everyday people, is for us to realize the everyday experiences of our lives, and these things represent culture. At some place, at some point on this planet right now, as we sit, some black woman's getting her hair braided. We know this is happening. And this is a centuries-old tradition that has not left us. There are simply things that are about us that will continue to be about us. When we hear Richard Pryor do a Mudbone monologue, I always think those would make great films. He's being a storyteller in the most African sense of the word and of the tradition. And on that note, I hope I've said something that has made sense. I was listening to, in conclusion, I was listening to Stevie Wonder and Sylvie Kande this morning, and what I like to do is put them in the CD player and just push random and let the brothers go for it. Now, hey, it's deep, it's deep, it's deep, it's deep. You take not Songs in the Key of Life, the one which you hadn't done nothing, we're talking about higher ground, and, you know, so you put Salif up in there too, you have something, you know, that is transcendental. And I think music is going to be one of the links that draws us, because, as you said, there is a universality about music. And if we can exploit those common grounds, which are part of our everyday experiences, I think when we really start to see what is going to happen when Africans and African Americans, when we get together, it's just going to be like Michael Jordan or Clyde Drexler. There'll be hang time. There'll be moves that no one has ever seen before. There will be things that happen in terms of cinematic technique that will be grounded in an African aesthetic. Thank you.
One of the numerous things I do in the world of film and video is I teach visual literacy workshops. The most popular one that I teach, I usually call some version of the image of Africa in film and television. And again, I don't use that title naively at all. I call it that because I know that's how my audience is going to hear me. That I'm going to attract a wide range of African Americans who care deeply about issues of representation in the media, or wrestling with it, are confused about it, and tend to talk in terms of image, often positive or negative, and who tend to use that word Africa in a non-problematized way. I was thrilled to hear the African brother at the earlier panel say, even in this highly educated, sophisticated group, Africa is a continent, not a country. That's how I start my workshops, once I get folks in the room. One of the things that I'm doing with these workshops, I set up the themes and the issues because I pretty much know what folks in the community are interested in, or I will set up a theme or an issue if they will tell me, if the host organization will tell me what they want to talk about. I always also deal with things like the black male, the black woman, the black male and black man and the black woman together in the media, things that are hot topics for folks. But my agenda has to deal with more than representation. People come ready to objectify the moving image that they see. They tend to come with a very self-righteous attitude, like we're hip, righteous folks, and why do they keep putting this distorted mess in film and television? What I want to do with them is to not only problematize the so-called image, but to also problematize their own process of the making of meaning as viewers, as spectators. My background comes out of, you can probably guess, critical studies. I love critical theory. And what I've been trying to figure out for 15 years now is how to use the critical theory that I think is so important in a way that makes the insights available through it available to the general lay viewing public. I am, for the most part, not using the language of critical theory. I'm not even using most of the language of film production. I'll bring some up if people ask. I'll throw some in because they think it's sexy, but I'm not looking to throw in a lot of new language that will distance people from what is going on. I'm constructing a process. My pedagogy is basically Freirean. Each workshop is set up as a community cultural circle in the Freirean sense, and I'm using the television and the film we look at almost in the same way that Freire used the still images that he would hold up in his literacy circles that he taught. Okay, let me give you an example. Oh, let me go back one second. Manthia said, we all have our Africa. Now, you know, with the plethora, I mean, number one, how many countries are there in Africa? I can't remember on the African continent. I can't remember myself at this moment, but many, many, many. How many languages? What was it? It used to be thousands. How many ethnic groups? Whoa, many, many, many. I start out there. My assumption is that the African American audience has that any given person in the audience has some piece of that construction known in the United States of America as Africa that we have all absorbed through misinformation, lack of education, you know, the full range of things. So I start out every workshop with The Birth of a Nation. I'm teaching visual literacy, remember? And so what I'm interested is the history of the moving image in this country and where we got these original concepts from. I show in the African workshop the first 5 minutes of The Birth of a Nation. If I had time, I'd show the whole thing. When you hear everything I show, you'll see why I have to show bits and pieces of most things. I show the first 5 minutes, which for those of you who have not seen it, consist of, you know, the opening credits, Griffith's little statement that he made in response to W.E.B. Du Bois and everybody else who was trying to, who was crusading against the film at that time, saying that, as I paraphrase, he didn't mean no harm, he just loves black folks, and he's just trying to tell the story of this war so that brother never fights brother again. That's a very loose version of what he says up front. The first image in Birth of a Nation, after the first intertitle, says, again, I'm paraphrasing, all our problems started with the bringing of the African to these shores. That's the first intertitle of the film. Cut to first image, an African standing, shackled, bent over on the slave block. First image, very important. We wrestle with that some. And I won't go into everything I do in terms of my pedagogical tools in these workshops, but I have 3 or 4 specific tools that are taught and interwoven throughout. These things last all day, from Saturday morning till as late as folks can hang on Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening. Second film I show is the original Tarzan, 1932. I show a particular segment, since I can't show the whole thing. I show when Jane has first gotten to Africa and she is visiting her father. She has surprised her father. And all of a sudden they hear a sound. They hear some drums. They hear some singing. And Jane says, as she's been changing her clothes, oh, what is that? And they go to the window of her father's house, which is on a soundstage somewhere in California with a rear projection screen outside the window. And they look out the window, and there are Africans. Now, this footage is very famous footage. It's some actual ethnographic footage shot in the late 20s. Well, I guess it would have to be the late 20s. It must be 1930, because it's sound footage, ethnographic footage shot on the continent of Africa. Even if you are not a specialist in African studies, you can see in that footage that there are at least, in the first footage, there are at least 6 different ethnic groups from widely distant geographic areas in full regalia for some specific ceremonial purpose. Jane says to her father, what's the occasion? And he says, oh, they're coming to trade. This is what they do when they are coming to trade here. The next cut is you go. She was so thrilled. She wants to go out and see these people. She actually walks across the sound stage in front of this rear projection screen. The people are projected at life size. Jane walks across it and talks to the African women who are holding babies and clucks over their babies as if this complete alienation of representation wasn't taking place, as if they did not exist on two different levels of reality within this representation. It's very powerful if you go back and look at it. So you can tell by this time that I am teaching, we are beginning to explode the popular notion of image, and they are beginning to look at film techniques, begin to understand how the particular techniques of representation begin to construct meaning. The third film I show is Song of Freedom. People are real tired by that time of looking at racist bullshit. They want to see something good. I say, oh, we're going to see a Paul Robeson film. They're so thrilled. They know it's got to be not only good but correct if Paul Robeson is in it, right? And I try to show that in its entirety. Very powerful, because on the one hand, there he is, fine as he wants to be, singing. It's one of his better singing roles, really singing wonderfully as this London dock worker who becomes a famous singer and uses his money to go back to Africa and help his people. He arrives on the continent with some made-up African name, country name, in his white suit and his white pith helmet, at which time people are squirming in their seats. And he spends a lot of time being very disgusted with the primitive hygiene of the country. And his people are downtrodden under this woman ruler who's not just an ogre, but apparently a crazy ogre. For those of you who haven't seen the film, please see the film. It's fascinating. So at that point, the discussion after that is extremely powerful, because one of the things I want them to begin to get, that whatever it is that they may be endorsing in 1996 as correct, has its problematical issues also, which they will certainly read 10 years from now, but why not read them now? Why wait to have this long historical time pass before you can see the problems in things? And also, as you look at the problems in things, it doesn't mean that you don't see the things that really work, the things that are really good, and that may even be positive. At this point, I usually show a film by an African filmmaker. For a long time, I showed Chedo, talking about making the bridge, the films that really hit that moment in history where the African-American experience branches off. It is useful often to show a film that makes some reference to that. For many years, I've showed Chedo because it's referring to the Muslim incursion across the desert. It's got the Catholic Church coming up from the West Coast inland, and it's got the traders with the guns and the liquor who are beginning to trade people there. It's a fabulous film to show for many different reasons. One of my issues now is that I also want to show contemporary urban African cinema, and that I want to show at any rate more than one. One does not do it. Again, for the reasons that people talked about on the last panel and have also mentioned here, that whole multiplicity of cultural realities on the continent cannot be served by any one film, no matter how great. At some point, I show the first 15 minutes of the first episode of Roots, remember? And again, this is one of those where you're questioning on the one hand, and you're teaching people to question what they're seeing, and at the same time, you're acknowledging what that did for people. I don't know whether you all can remember, I can definitely remember that Roots made a big difference, almost as much difference as the civil rights movement made in terms of whether people were willing to call themselves black, Roots made a big difference in people calling themselves African and African American. That the African experience is distorted and inaccurate is another thing that they can learn to read. I show, Clyde mentioned Coming to America. That's a very powerful piece. Again, I show those first 15 minutes where you're supposedly on the African continent with all the pastel colors and the marble palace or whatever it was. I show a film called Azandi's Dream. Has anybody heard of Azandi's Dream? It's by a black filmmaker, Horace Jenkins, who used to teach at Howard many years ago. And I keep saying one of these days Howard is going, he died quite a few years ago. A bolt of lightning is going to strike me and I'll know that it's Howard for abusing his reputation and his name and his film. I show it because there is still popular in the black community the idea that if we just get the equipment, if we just learn how to make the equipment, we can make all these things that will be perfect and will be have no problems and just let us at it with no analytical capabilities at all, with no ideological grounding. This film, Azandi's Dream, was a documentary made in Sudan, deeply problematical, inauthentic, dishonest, I would go so far as to say. When I can get it, I show one of Flora Ngugu Shelling's films, one of her documentaries from Tanzania. I show in its entirety Reassemblage by Trin Minha. And those of you who know that work and know the work of Minha know that she is a brilliant theoretician who makes films that are deemed difficult, especially for the popular audience. By the time we get to that and have worked through a lot of stuff, people are loving Reassemblage. They are getting it. They are beginning to understand what Minha is trying to do without feeling like that's some elite, somebody over there who is doing stuff that we don't understand. They're beginning to get issues of subject position, the questioning of gender representations and a whole range of things. And I show some experimental work by Philip Mallory Jones, who made a whole string of experimental pieces from footage that he shot in West Africa. The whole issue is, for me, problematizing not simply the image, but the process of viewing in the popular African American audience.
Can I just interrupt here for a moment to point out that Richard Pena is in the house. As the rappers say, we got Pena in the house. And he's going to be one of our panelists. We knew beforehand that he would join us late, but I would like to ask him to squeeze in now, and at an appropriate moment we'll hear from him. Okay. At this point, we'll carry on and hear from Rob Nixon.
Thanks. First of all, I wanted to thank Manthia and Don very much for inviting me here today. And I wanted to pick up on the urban questions of urbanness and modernity. And I'm going to be talking about one of the 52 countries in Africa, South Africa, and a particular period, the 1950s and the 1960s, when there was a major political and cultural battle over the rights of urban residents. This was the period when the apartheid regime launched on a scale that it never had before an onslaught on the notion of black urban identity, the right to belong in the city. And I just wanted to make a few brief comments today about what I see as the particular grounds of appeal that American popular culture, broadly speaking, music and film, had during this period for a lot of black urban residents in the Johannesburg and Cape Town areas and so forth. Okay, I thought I'd preface this by saying that, just by giving some idea of the extreme adversity of cultural work in the 1950s and 60s and what it was like at the time. Around about 1960, the apartheid regime introduced new censorship laws which cited 97 categories of representation that could cause a book or a film to be banned. By the end of that decade, I think there were several hundred films and 11,000 books that had been outlawed. I won't read all 97 categories, but I'll read some of them. These include murder, suicide, death, horror, cruelty, fighting, brawling, ill treatment, lawlessness, gangsterism, robbery, crime, the techniques of crime, tippling, drunkenness, trafficking in or addiction to drugs, smuggling, sexual intercourse, prostitution, promiscuity, white slaving, licentiousness, lust, passionate love scenes, sexual assault, rape, sodomy, masochism, sadism, sexual bestiality, abortion, change of sex, nightlife, physical poses, nudity, scant or inadequate dress, divorce, marital infidelity, adultery, illegitimacy, human degeneracy, or any other similar or related phenomenon, in case that's not specific enough. Okay. So as you can imagine, there was no film produced or book written that wouldn't fall foul of at least one of those categories. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is also that these weren't just regarded as morally inappropriate, but were specified as prejudicial to the safety of the state. Okay, so if you had nightlife in your film, that was prejudicial to the safety of the state. Okay, so the atmosphere, the cultural atmosphere, was one of extreme paranoia. And what I think is significant here is that so much of the cultural focus for this paranoia was directed at the moving image. Television as a technology was entirely banned in South Africa until 1976. There were no TV sets. And as I say, enormous numbers of films were either banned or butchered and became, in narrative terms, sometimes incomprehensible as a result. Okay. Now, this was part of a period of very intense crackdown on black urban culture. And there was, I think, a deliberate onslaught on the part of the cultural commissars of the apartheid regime on what they saw as cosmopolitan influences on black South African culture, and thereby an onslaught against the right to choose your point of entry into urban modernity, okay, musically, cinematically, imagistically, okay. The flip side of this, of course, was that in the 1950s and the 1960s were the period when the Bantustan system was being engineered. The idea being that the regime would disperse black solidarity by declaring that there was no such thing as a black South African. There were merely 10 ethnic groups. And those ethnic groups were all fundamentally rural people. And this was an attempt to keep the cities, which had been the central areas where resistance were fomented, to destabilize black claims on the city and black culture in the city, okay? And so that even if you were born in the city, if your grandparents were in the city, had been born in the city, if you went back generations, you were effectively constructed as an illegal alien in the urban area of your birth. You really belonged in a rural region. And so in this context, one of the writers and intellectuals of the 1950s, a fellow called Clyde Taylor, described this process as the apartheid regime was trying to fossilize Africans, trying to turn them into tribal inventions, okay? And what we saw was in response to this approach of tribalizing, fossilizing, ethnicizing, dividing and ruling, and de-urbanizing, we saw in a number of ways, I think, black bohemian culture and intellectual culture in the cities turned very much to American popular culture as a resource for alternative images of blacks belonging in the city and of the city as a place of cosmopolitan ferment rather than a segregated, sanitized space in the way that the regime was projecting. I should also add that this is particularly after 1960, when we had the Sharpeville massacre and the sudden collapse of the apartheid economy, there was a big distinction, I think, between the popular perceptions of American government and American business on the one hand, and popular conceptions of American popular culture. If it hadn't been for American banks and businesses, apartheid would have crashed a lot earlier, particularly after the Sharpeville massacre when there was an economic bailout. So I think there was, in the ANC, for instance, there was a very deep political disaffection with political ideology coming from America, but that was largely kept apart, I think, from popular culture in many ways, okay? The journalists and creative writers, musicians and artists and even gangsters in the urban areas largely drew on American style, both in musical forms and Hollywood images. There was a very strong appeal of American clothes, records, movie stars. Urban slang was picked up from films. There was a sort of cult interest in things like Woodrow hats and Florsheim shoes and Palm Beach shirts and that sort of thing. So labels became important in this period. Film stars like Dorothy Dandridge, Sidney Poitier, Humphrey Bogart, James Cagney, Richard Widmark, all became popular idols. As well as musicians, Count Basie, Dizzy Gillespie, Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, and so forth. And South African performers like Abdullah Ibrahim, Miriam Makeba, Dolly Ratebe have all spoken about this traffic in musical images. One of South Africa's top performers from the 1950s and 60s, a guy called Peter Rezant, and I quote him, said, I loved Duke Ellington. I loved his music because it always had that African sound, the sound of a fellow underneath his blanket walking through the city, repeating this thing for a long time and also humming there, So black American music and film, and American film generally, I think, helped give South Africa's embattled urban artists and intellectuals a sense of a more international heritage, both in a black diasporic sense and I think in a cosmopolitan sense as well. Now, I wanted to just conclude by saying a few things about the movie house as an urban space, because I think this was very important in the period. The greatest concentration of black creativity in this period was in a community called Sophiatown, which was raised in the late 1950s, eliminated by the regime under the system of forced removals. But that was where most of the black middle class was. That was where the politicians, the journalists, musicians largely lived. And there was a movie house there called the Odeon Theatre, which was one of the few large public spaces. And this became a very frequent center for political protest meetings. For instance, in the 50s, Nelson Mandela gave many of his earliest speeches in the ANC Youth League in the Odeon Theatre. So it was both a space that people associated with police attacks, police dogs, batons, tear gas, and so forth. And this was the place where American movies were shown. This was the biggest theatre in Sophiatown. So I think if we look at the appropriation of the space and the appropriation of images coming from America, there were some very specific connections. And it had a lot to do with the question of illegality. To be a black South African suddenly in the 1950s was to be an illegal. A black urban South African was to be an illegal. If you lost your job, you lost your right to live in the city, even if you had been born there. And so images coming from American film of outlaws and gangsters in particular were picked up very often and adapted in the youth culture at the time. The gangs in Sophiatown took Cold War names like they called themselves the Americans, the Russians, the Berliners. They lifted names from movies. The head honchos in the gangs were sometimes called themselves Gunnar Martin, Boston Blackie, Durango Kid, Lefty, Styles. Okay, and this was all part of the styling of outlaw culture, in a sense. Bloke Morisani, one of the most gifted chroniclers of this period, who lived the most of his life in exile in Germany, looking back on that period, spoke of the banditry of the law that apartheid introduced there, and he talked about a kind of counterculture of banditry that emerged, that drew on these Hollywood images. Some of the hits that ran in Sophiatown were Howard Hawks' Scarface, Stanley Kramer's The Defiant Ones, Joseph Mankiewicz' No Way Out, and the particular favorite that I don't think it ever stopped running was William Cayley's Street with No Name, starring Richard Widmark as the gang boss Styles. And there was for a number of years in the 1950s, there was one of the marks of street credibility was to wear an overcoat and adopt a sort of posture of Richard Widmark chomping an apple. An apple became a kind of status symbol in the scene. Finally, there was a particular term that was used in this period for street gangsters, and they were called tsotsis, which was an adaptation of the term zoot-suits. Okay, zoot-suits in Zulu became tsotsis. Okay, so the tsotsis were these kids who bridged the world of Hollywood fantasy and Sophiatown street life. What is particularly interesting is that they enjoyed an ambiguous status in the community because these gangs were often very violent and much feared, but at the same time they were the one group of people in the community who stood up to the apartheid police, who had a certain, who had the weaponry, who had a certain bravado about them in this context. Also, many of the most vocal and visible people in Black Bohemia took up the idea of the tsotsi as a metaphor for their own creativity, their own embattled resistance position in the world of the arts. So, for instance, Lewis Nkosi, who was one of the leading writers of this period and now teaches at the University of Wyoming, speaking of his colleague, the journalist Can Temba, said, and I quote, "He was the supreme intellectual tsotsi. In the words of the blues singer, he was always raising hell in the neighborhood. The neighborhood in which he raised hell was that somber, fearful community of the intellect, so hideously terrorized by the political regime in South Africa," unquote. So South Africa's embattled black artists turned very much to the imagery of American films and music in the quest for a kind of outlaw projection of themselves, as I say, a counter-banditry. And through this became integrated into the wider political movement to assert that the cities belonged to the people and that they had every intention of staying. Thank you.
Going back with you?
Reggie?
Okay. Okay. Actually, I'm going to do something very performative here and include the audience. So I'm going to pass out. Maybe we can do somebody. You have something to write with, don't you? Take a couple minutes.
He wants some help.
Everybody take notes. Definitely. Okay. All right, so we can start. And before I start, I want to thank, like everyone has done already, thank Mahin for putting together this, inviting me to the panel, but also just beginning this ritual of this African Film Festival. I met Mahin also in Wagga, and she took me around and introduced me to everybody, and she was really great. Question one. There's 3 questions for everybody. Where, when, or what artifact makes you feel the most African? You can write it in like 1 word or 3 words, 5 words. Where do you feel the most African, or when do you feel the most African? Or what cultural artifact makes you feel the most African? Okay. I know it's ambiguous, but give it a try. Or what? Just pick one of the 3. Where, or when, or what cultural artifact makes you feel the most African? I mean, I'm considering here everybody considers himself African in this room, right? Second question. When, or where, or what cultural artifact makes you feel the most American? And the last question is, where or when or what cultural artifact makes you feel the most African American?
Just fried chicken. Just get the dough count. Just fried chicken count.
You can write chicken.
Fried chicken.
Fried chicken, yeah, you can write that. Okay, I'm going to try to just do this. In 1986, I managed to get a job at the then Black Filmmaker Foundation Distribution Center. And I was rummaging through all the files, and I found this article, and I believe it was by Clyde Taylor. And it said that black films were looking for a home. And I didn't really know what that meant at the time, but it began a journey for me as a writer and as someone who, like Cheryl, tries to show films and tries to get people to talk about their experiences with film and explore this idea of what is it to look for a home, what is it to look for a community. Very different possibly from African film, which is looking for its history. The topic I want to talk about today is not so much about popular culture, something that's very much something that we perform, that we're aware of, like dance and music and religion, our fashion, but something I want to call African American dispopular culture. Dis as in D-Y-S from the Greek, meaning hard culture. Or if you don't want to use the Greek, since this is an African Film Festival, you can use D-I-S, black, as in I'm going to diss popular culture. And just my thoughts, these are just things I'm interested in exploring. And it's kind of a continuation. I feel a lot of us here, I mean, people on this panel are my teachers, and I look at the work I try to do as having a dialogue with them. So it's a continuation of a talk that Hortense Spillers gave about a month ago here at NYU, and her interest in Frantz Fanon's look at the psychic map of the black subject. And part of my aim is to try to talk about what this panel wanted to talk about, which the idea of a bridge. And I'll say that I'll look at being African American as being that bridge, a diasporic subject as being a bridge. What does it mean to be a bridge? What is a bridge? To go back, something that allows you to go back and forth. Hopefully it's an exchange. You might say that Du Bois' dialectic, that the 20th century's most important subject would be the color line, is a dialectical question which tied Africans in America with Europe. He thought that was very important, that we don't give up our Africanness and that we also don't give up our interest in Europe. So what does it mean to be caught in that dialectic, particularly in a time when we recognize ourselves as world people and that we are more than just our relationship to Africa, which is our priority, but to Europe? The second thing I'm interested in is this type of hypertextual approach. I'm saying it that way, but so you won't say that I'm scattered. I'm just jumping around the way you do in the 90s. And the third thing is I want to suggest that the remapping of blackness and Africanness is very much not about the popular right now, because I think a lot of people are aware that it is always already in the process of being commodified for entertainment purposes. And particularly in this time of nationalism sprouting up all over the world, it's very easy to take in cultural material and leave the people behind. And that's what we're finding in France and in Germany, different places where African popular culture, African culture, is at the center, but the people are not allowed in. Okay, so I was really impressed with Wanjiru's story of how she became interested in griot through going to Germany and meeting Mamadou. So I'm going to give three little examples of that kind of non-traditional approach to identity. The first is taking my girlfriend to my family's house in Detroit. She was born in, she's of Jamaican parentage. She grew up in Britain. She went to school in Kansas City, Missouri. Goes to film school. Oh, she went to Ivy League school for undergrad. Is currently in film school in Milwaukee, home of Laverne and Shirley and cheap beer. She speaks like a Valley girl, except when she's around her Jamaican brothers and sisters and has to not twang. And when I took her to Detroit, to where my brother lives, who's has an MBA and is very bougie and fits into that demographic, that high percentile of cultural buying. Out in the suburbs of Detroit. He asked her, so how does it feel to be a foreigner? And I was like, I was kind of in the middle, but I wasn't sure who the foreigner was. The next thing is that I was talking to my friend here, Matthew, last night. I was like, I'm going to do this talk. It's kind of, I don't know what I'm doing with this talk. He says, well, you have to talk about music. And that's the last thing I wanted to talk about. He kept saying, you kept talking about music, and everybody's talked about music. And he said, you kept talking about R&B, about the fact that that's all we grew up on. We played this music, which taught us about our sexuality, taught us about our self-conception. And then I went on and we kept talking, and I said, well, what about African Americans? If the music is so embraced and Michael Jackson is a god, what about African Americans? And I think it's a similar type of situation as in terms of like in Europe, in some ways, even though we have this priority relationship, that just because you can appropriate a culture or you can share a culture doesn't mean that you share your relationships with those people. It's not automatic. And the last thing is that I was talking to Fadika, one of the filmmakers, yesterday, and he was saying, I was talking about that after this presentation, I have to run to Geneva Dance and Drum because I'm in a beginner African dance class, and I'm in a recital tonight, and that's going to be really funny. And I was saying dance, and he said, oh, Alvin Ailey. I love Alvin Ailey. you know. And we were just, this idea that I hadn't seen Alvin Ailey in a while, but he was really into just having come from Apollo. Obviously, after that, he went to Sylvia's. And I haven't even been to Sylvia's in a while, but I'm in this dance class, and I'm trying to eat African food, which I'm really hungry for right now. Okay, so let me get into the subject a bit, and maybe we can get around to these questions. African American popular culture. It's what we're not talking about, and it's the seams in between what's African popular culture. So I have like 6 films that I want to mention, and these are just things that I'm exploring. I don't have answers to them, so I'm kind of doing this like an artist. I'm just kind of opening up the question. The first is Haile Gerima's Sankofa, a really amazing film. Some friends of mine were talking about the film, and one of the questions they were debating was this hierarchy of blackness and Africanness, whereupon if you take the character of Nunu, the African mother figure in the film, she was the embodiment of truth, of the ultimate Africanness. Down the line, the role played by Muda Baruka from the West Indies, from Jamaica, I believe, he was next in line, I guess, in terms of his truth, always trying to rebel and activist. And then further down the line in the diaspora were the non-enlightened African Americans, or the hybrids, who had to be transformed. And this idea that how do you problematize this African American relation, this diasporic relation, if it is only going to be something about truth being on one side and confusion on another? How do we really talk about it? The next is, it's actually not a film. Gayatri Spivak was talking about the work of the Black British workshops, and particularly a work by the group Sankofa. And she was talking about something that a lot of filmmakers in the West talk about, saving the world through technology. And that is, for her, was a particularly first world privilege that for a lot of third world countries, the idea of to be able to save the world through technology is not a possibility, whether it's through the internet or through a camera. So right now I'm working on a piece. I teach undergrad television here at NYU, but I'm also in the interactive telecommunications program here. And I got in that program because after the last Pan-African Cinema Conference, I think on one of the panels, Michael Schultz, who's director of the Car Wash, just kind of stopped the panel of all these filmmakers and said, had a copy of the Wall Street Journal and said, we're not dealing with new technology. And he opened up this big piece of paper, and I bought it, and immediately applied for the program, and now I'm working toward being a geekhead. But at that my particular interest was to be critical of of technology, of cinema in particular as apparatus, but also the idea of a technology which is not really accessible to a lot of people. But I'm working on this piece right now entitled Million Man March World Wide Web, which attempts to deal with the paranoid and utopian aspects of both these two types of technology, of these two different things, MMM, WWW, and that having went to the Million Man March, before I could even get home and even process it, I became very much aware of how people were invested even more than I was in my reality, in putting a definition on my reality. And that it's really important to find a way to talk about things in a non-prescribed manner. So I'm in the process of doing that. The next thing is a film by Isaac Julian entitled The Darker Side of Black. I don't know how many people have seen that film. Basically, it's attempts to talk about the question of the transcultural, the idea that hate speech, homophobia, and sexism could be transported through this technology which reduces time and space, through music, a song that could be produced. He particularly was talking about Buju Banton's Boom Bye Bye, and the idea that a song produced in Jamaica that didn't even play on the radio could be transported to the U.S. and into to Europe and lead to behaviors that would be, again, homophobic and sexist or hate speech. And the questions that I'm trying to ask around that particular film, one is this idea that, okay, one of the negative things that I'm trying to say about the film, or I'm trying to explore with the film, is that the idea that, okay, it's two things. One, the film is, I would see as hypertextual in its own sense. It, for me, traditional documentary tries to construct truth. In Isaac Julian's film, there's almost like an end to truth in one particular way. He has so many different scholars like Cornel West, Tricia Rose, who are attempting to try to talk about these particular issues of homophobia and black urban youth. Yet the film has so many seams in it, so many things that you could say to the contrary about what's going on. The film almost, for me, ends this possibility that we can use documentary film as a closure in itself, which has led me to write other things about it and also try to produce a review of the film, which is a hypertextual link that allows you to go to different places, at least for myself, different places where the film does not allows you to explore. The other thing is that mainly because he was worried about interviewing people in Jamaica from the gay community, you don't have anybody in the film who's actually speaking for themselves. And so that is a reasonable thing to do. At the same time, what it also doesn't do is deal with the possible class issues around homosexuality in that culture, in particular culture, and just assumes that those who are gay are being oppressed automatically and not in places of privilege. The next thing is, like Clyde brought up, Ousmane Sembène's Mbye Cham. He already mentioned that there's a character which is African American, and basically he's an ignorant, arrogant African American character at that particular point before he realizes that the person who he has tried to put in jail, they have something in common with the other soldier. That soldier is educated in the West and speaks French and is of different class status, but yet they managed to make some kind of link. I believe there's also gospel music in that particular film, as well as jazz music. Let me see. I'm just throwing different things out. Another piece was I went and saw Hold Up the Sun, which is showing here. It's kind of a eyes on the prize of South African cultural history or political history, and both that for positive reasons and negative reasons. That's I wanted to talk about that particular piece. It's really interesting to see all the different members of the players in the South African freedom struggle talking about their history. But I remember interviewing Todike Bambara about the making of Eyes on the Prize, and she talked about some of the discussions they had in the making of that, and I think a couple of them were around the question of the visible. If I think Henry Hampton's desire was that the entire film be made up of footage that already had been shot, and Tony Cade's reasoning around it was there were a lot of things that happened in the community at that time that were not on film, you know, and how do you make up for that difference between trying to working in a visual medium and dealing with history and people's interpretations of what that history is, you know. So when I was looking at Hold Up the Sun, I was thinking the same thing in terms of it's very important to try to tell this history, but what are the difficulties and what is missing here in terms of material that was not photographed, and how does that lead to, I think almost importantly, what we have here. I think Isaac Julian worked on a piece which you could say was an addendum to Eyes on the Prize in terms of like gay and lesbian participation in the civil rights struggle, and there's other works which are kind of adding on to this. There is a clip I wanted to show by a filmmaker, Alonzo Spate, which is entitled "Who's Going to Take the Weight?" And I think one of the things that I had wanted to make a point here was this idea of dialogue, that we're constantly in dialogue, and even these little minutiae points that I'm kind of throwing out here, which may be of only interest to me, are actually happening in smaller groups in dialogue. Alonzo Spates...
Reggie, I'm curious to know how I came out on the quiz myself.
Okay.
And I was thinking maybe you could show the film afterwards, perhaps?
Yeah, I will. Okay. My time is up? I'm rambling?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let me just say one last thing in relationship to this question that Jackie brought up about slavery and the Middle Passage and what it means in terms of popular cultural and production. In looking at The Darker Side of Black again, Bell Hooks, in trying to talk about the film, said that it may be that slavery, the slavery mentality, is what's affecting black urban youth today in terms of street crime and in terms of a certain kind of urban behavior. But it doesn't seem like that type of scenario is very productive for us to continually talk about what's going on. And so I wanted to try to maybe think about how we move around that question of slavery as that defining moment. And I came to something that Essex Hemphill, the late Essex Hemphill, said at the Black Nations Queer Nations Conference a couple of months ago, or a few months ago. And he said, I think it's important to understand or realize that our ancestors were kings and queens, but some of us had to bring the water, and some of us had to bring the food, and some of us had to be the servants. And it probably was my parents that were that, you know. And what I'm trying to say is that, and look at, is that there's always been upheavals throughout. If you look at from antiquity on, there's always been upheavals for the common folk in black culture, from Africa to America. And if you look at those continual upheavals, which have made African people diasporic people again and again and again throughout culture, throughout time, it gives me a very different picture of an African American diasporic subject as a lot more, a mix of a lot more situations than just that particular defining moment, and makes me want to look back further. Okay.
Richard Pena is the director of the Film Society of the Lincoln Center.
Okay, first let me just apologize for coming late. I was on something else uptown, so I could only come in, and I'm sorry I missed a few of the panelists so far. Just briefly, I wanted to offer some comments and perhaps some observations, I guess, from my position as a film programmer and as someone who has been involved with the African Film Festival pretty much since its inception, and to talk about perhaps where we are, or where I think we're at after this third edition is well underway. I guess I'd like to also mention that I feel very grateful to be on the panel, since not being an African or an African American, although I was very flattered to be asked what made me feel African American just now. It was sort of a defining moment, so I'll probably get back to that. Anyway, last year at a wonderful conference here at NYU, Manthia Diawara was the organizer of, Stuart Hall, in his, I guess, was final address, I think warned everyone there that while in the preceding days there had been many talks about links and connections and resonance between African and African American or Afro-European cultures, that we shouldn't, speaking to the audience, that we shouldn't forget our differences. That in fact, Stuart Hall, as an African Jamaican living in Britain, felt that his experience was already very different from people back in his home island. And that experience was very different from both Africans on the continent and African Americans. So that, in a sense, those differences should be explored and celebrated. And he was warning, I think, of a tendency in contemporary discourse to often negate them. I think that question of difference is an interesting one, especially when it comes to looking at the movies, because if there's a theme that runs through African films, and there are lots of themes, I myself am very suspicious of the notion of an African film aesthetic or any aesthetic. Any continent with that many people, that many cultures, that many languages produces far more than one. But if there's a theme that one sees again and again played out and looked at very brilliantly in the films, it's often the theme of the ancestor, Keita being a wonderful recent example. And it's always very moving to see how, despite the extraordinary upheavals on the continent over centuries, that traditions like griot and ancestor and learning of your past continue and form a vital part of that culture. And yet I think in terms of parentage in cinema, it's a very problematic notion. On the one hand, I think African Americans look to Africa very much as a kind of source of inspiration for culture and cultural ideas. Yet on the other hand, America is the home of the movies, or it's the place where the movies have somehow filled its or received its fullest expression. So there's a sense in which Africans look perhaps to the descendants or to the children, in a sense, for leadership in that position. And I think this kind of dialectic that's set up between this problematic parentage is maybe something that should be addressed. In terms of, I think, the African-American film experience, and thinking of it in terms of other independent or parallel cinemas in the United States, there's obviously a long history that's been well discussed and detailed in several books that have been coming out. But I think in the recent history, another sort of defining moment in a way was, at least from my position, the great success of She's Gotta Have It. Obvious in a way. But I think what was more to the point about that success is that, in a sense, that success did not lead to the creation of, in essence, a kind of alternative cinema that would be run and made by African Americans. If on the contrary, in a sense, Spike signed a 3-year deal or a 3-picture deal with Universal. This is not to sort of say anything about him. He's an artist. He has to survive the way he needs to survive, and he's done great work with that contract. Yet I think, in a sense, what it did was very much shift the sort of focus of African-American filmmaking to becoming a kind of subset of Hollywood filmmaking. It was a particular strain or kind of Hollywood filmmaking. And you look at the work that was done, say, from the mid-'70s to the early, well, to up until She's Gotta Have It, in a sense, it seemed to be work that somehow wasn't recuperable, to my mind, within Hollywood models. Passing Through, or Killer of Sheep, or Illusions, or any of the extraordinary independently produced works of that era seemed to really promise the growth and birth of a kind of truly alternative African-American cinema. And I think the success of She's Gotta Have It perhaps proved both a blessing and curse in that sense. It showed, in a sense, that the next step, the logical step, was, of course, to go into Hollywood and somehow be subsumed within that. One of, I think, the results of that, in a way, was not only in terms of the filmmaking and aesthetics that were produced by that assumption of the nascent African-American cinema at that point into Hollywood, was the fact that I think corresponding structures of distribution and exhibition were never set up. So in a sense, looking at the African cinema attempting to make its way here, looking at what possibilities there are, they're essentially the possibilities that are open for any foreign film, the art circuits or the film festival Cinematheque circuit. That there is no independent African-American circuit in distribution or exhibition, I think, truly set up that could provide a welcome for this cinema. And I think that's a tremendous shame, because my own view is that I think America, the United States, and Canada perhaps too, will provide, I think, in many ways, the real basis for the African cinema in the future. The legacy of colonialism is such in Africa that making money, even distributing African films in Africa, is a nightmare that many people here know far more about. And I think the constant waiting for European subsidies is, I think, as we all know, a real trap. So in essence, I think a market has to be created, and the clearest logical market for African work, I think, is here in the United States. Yet, on the other hand, how can this work enter? What are the circuits? What are the ways that it can somehow find, in many ways, I think, a large and very willing group of people wanting to see this work? So in a sense, I think that was one of the reasons why I was anxious to sort of get involved in something like the African Film Festival. My hope was always that the African Film Festival would be a bridge, that we would show, we would prove to people that there was this great market there for African films, for not only African Americans, but Americans of all cultures. And I think, in fact, we've proved it. Yet, as time goes on, I worry more and more that this bridge that Mahan strove so hard to try and set up, and I tried to help her on, might be looked at more and more as a kind of terminal point. I'll leave with that.
Well, we will now open up for questions from the floor, and I'll look to Dawn for a signal for how many questions we can entertain for how long. But what are your questions or concerns? Yes. See yours, Charlie.
I'd like to comment on this last question. I don't know why this.
I was gonna collect them and.
My reaction to this question is that I think your idea defines who you are, not necessarily your wardrobe or what you put in your house. And I'm from Nigeria, and for me, I have to switch in and out of each of these three categories that you just asked for here, depending on where I am and what occasion. And my reason for doing that is that I think it's much more an attitude that is based on tolerance, that there is somebody around you who's different or who's from another place. And there's a need for you to look into this person and also appreciate what they are and where they came from. And a funny experience I had a few years ago with a Nigerian person. I told him that he's not African enough, and he almost strangled me because he always, 1,000% of the time, was culturally dressed, and at the same time behaved in a foreign way. So to me, and so I found that perplexing and almost upsetting each time I'm around him. So that day, he just jumped out of me. I said, "You're an African enough." And he looked at me, he looked behind and said, "Are you talking to me?" I said, "Yes." He got up. So we started running. And that was how serious and how offended he was. He felt to feel destroyed by it, But it's what I'm talking about. That, some people, especially I have observed that with some African Americans who think to get dressed in African outfits, that's it, they're African, and vice versa. So your idea and your politics, basically, is what makes you who you are. Like Robert Nixon there, you're from South Africa.
Right, that's right.
Yeah. Okay, he's white, but until I know deep what kind of politics and ideals that he practices, then I will know, well, is he African or white African or both or none at all.
Or a New Yorker. I've been here 15 years, yeah. Right.
I mean, the point of the whole card thing for me was for two reasons. One, the whole idea is, I think in this particular time of media's oversaturation, that for a lot of African Americans, being African American means going into certain spaces that are African American, and in between, it's very hard to be that. Okay, and then the second thing is just living in the States. We don't have a very intelligent dialogue about difference, even still. And being aware of that difference is the beginning, which Cheryl is doing in her workshops. But then to begin to try to move on it, I do surveys before most of my screenings as well, just to get something going. So you could say those things. You know?
I see a hand over there. I can't hear you. Sorry.
I am just spectator. I say thank you for having insight into filmmaking. I have one question for the lady on the topic of slavery. The thing that you're doing on slavery, is it dealing with the present or the past scenario?
The present or the past
Scenarios.
It's a historical documentary, so it deals with the introduction of basically slavery to the United States, to what becomes the United States, begins in Africa and Europe and comes here. So it's from the 1619 to the beginning of the Civil War.
So basically, just dealing with the past.
Well, yeah, it's basically a historical documentary, but I mean, a lot of what we're trying to do with it is to think about what the contemporary issues are that can be addressed by the series. So, you know, even though it is set in the past, hopefully, you know, we'll have some resonance in, you know, in a contemporary kind of dialogue about, you know, what slavery has meant to the United States as a country, what it means to us as black people in terms of a diaspora experience.
Why I ask you that question because there's a lot of people that are coming to this country that are becoming lost in the cracks, let's say, of this whole country. And they're winding up in like a slavery type situation. So I thought maybe that we're, you know, going to be different in investigating or documenting or navigating.
Well, I think it is different. And I mean, there isn't a lot in terms of a national dialogue about slavery in this country. I mean, other than Roots and a couple of, you know, documentaries in Sankofa, Haile Gerima Sankofa, there isn't a lot available, particularly from an African-American made perspective about the legacy of slavery or the experience of slavery. So, I mean, you know, it's a lot to do from 1619 to 1860 as it is, and you know, we basically can't come up to the present.
One thing I want to say, maybe I can listen to somebody else. Let's say, take for example, people coming from Asia or Africa, and they are winding up, let's say, in situations that are beyond control. All that slavery, that present-day reality.
I'd like to just throw in that I have seen several films that do deal with virtual slavery, people coming from Jamaica as migrant workers, people in Florida who are practically kept in concentration camps. There are some films about those subjects. I can't give you the titles of them, but some people have dealt with those subjects before. Yes, it's a very important issue, and it troubles me deeply as well. But yes, there are films on that. There are films on that. Yes, I see her.
I go to movies probably saved, and I know my personal history being 42, the African films of the beginning of the early 80s really were as much as Black Blues movies kind of a salvation from all around the Negro films.
Finyan?
Faces of Women on Song. But movies like Faces of Women Young. And I wish there'd been more talk, given that there's been so many movies. I think classically great films since the late 70s come out of that generation after the 60s, African filmmakers. So many great films, but there'd been more talk about specific films. But I'm glad Mr. Pena brought up the points he raised. But what I'm concerned about, having viewed all these great movies over the last 15 years, is who in Africa? And I know some of them who in Africa watches these movies in private culture. So in English speaking in Africa, I think you see it. And also who in America, living in New York, I may know the album, my friends may know a movie like the album, but how many people like me get to see Yaga in Chicago or LA or Atlanta? I mean, so how are these movies being transmitted around the world? And if they're not being transmitted, given that there's, I think, such great documents, is there going to be a lag time when eventually someone will see Yaga or faces of women, and there will be a larger popular cultural American reaction to such great film documents?
Well, on the question of who sees the African films in Africa, I'd like to defer to my colleague Mbye Cham from Howard University, who, as well as anyone else in the room, can give us some idea of what the African audience is likely to be.
Trying to relax.
But I think basically this is one of the major questions for African filmmakers. But other than the normal distribution circuit, I think the major venues where some of these films are seen by a great number of people concentrated here would be at festivals like the one we are during the 10 days here. What films from diaspora places that are shown. But unfortunately, at the end of the festival, the normal fare goes on the phone circuit. And this is, I guess, a situation that is replicated in other countries in Africa. As far as outside of Africa is concerned, again, mostly the festival circuit. There have been some few that have made it into the normal distribution circuit.
Clyde, can I speak to that?
Yeah,
Can I
just
speak to that?
About one of the films that was in the festival, Wanjiru's film, Battle of the Sacred Tree. She explained to me that it had no distribution in Kenya, for example.
Right.
And it has not been commercially distributed.
It's been shown twice in Kenya, she mentioned.
Screenings, and she personally went around to different movie houses and tried to get people to show, commercial movie houses to show the film, and she learned through conversations with people she had loved the film with that they didn't even take the time to look at the film to assess whether it was worth running in their theaters or not. And that's a film that was very successful here in our festival, and the majority of Kenyans don't.
Gimba will play.
I start almost like Reggie with cards. And the first question I ask people is, what's your favorite film in the entire world? After that, I ask them, what's the film they hate most in the entire world? And after that, I ask them, what film is there that you just don't get? Which is a tricky question for most people, because the ones you really don't get, you kind of immediately blank out, right? But then I go down a list. What's your favorite film by an African American? What's your favorite film by an African? I say, what's your favorite African American film? What's your favorite film by an African? And people just tend to say, what do you mean? African film. What do you mean African American? When I do that workshop that I described on Africa, I would say that at least slightly more than 50%, let's say somewhere between 60 and 70% of the people have never seen an African film before when I show them Chedo. I'm always saying, oh, I should show different things. I shouldn't just show some Ben. I should do, a lot. And I should, because for reasons I was talking about earlier, because no one film by any one filmmaker from one culture, one ethnic group, one language can do it. But still, people have not seen an African film, but we know there's a 30-year history of African cinema, right? They also have not seen films. I will say, what's your favorite film, or what name a film by an African American woman? And people will often come out with The Color Purple. And in just in terms of my workshops, that's often the level of consciousness I'm working with. And these are not dumb or uneducated people. That's the fascinating part. They're often very political people, but their practices in other areas they do not bring into the area of film. Their level of consciousness in other areas they do not bring in. Just in terms, most African films in the United States are shown on college campuses, in museums, and in festivals. And people are always saying, after they see one, where can I see more of this? And whatever city I'm in, I will point out to them the universities, the museums, the venues that I happen to know about. It's not happening.
Any other questions?
Could I just add something about that? Yeah. again, to add to what Mbye said, in South Africa, the Johannesburg Film Festival is a central conduit for African film, and again, a lot on campuses. But one of the things that is happening right at this moment is the transformation of South African TV. And I have friends who are on the new board who are debating these issues, and it has come up, admittedly peripherally, but there are people interested in pushing this, the prospect of showing African films on South African TV, particularly Francophone African films. There's a big push to increase the cultural ties between South Africa. The new cultural Minister of Culture in particular is very ambitious in this regard. And one of the things you're seeing is a new kind of intra-African, whether you call it cultural imperialism or cultural outreach is a question. But South African TV is shown in parts of, in Zambia, Kenya, for instance. A lot of it has reached beyond South African borders. So if African films were to get on South African TV, they would increase their audience incrementally well beyond South Africa's borders. So I mean, that's, it seems to me a major distributional question at this stage.
Can I?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
African film is still relatively young, and in terms of the perspective that Richard voiced, he has an insight, but to go into my African Americanness, there were times when I was being raised and anything that was progressive, everybody's not always going to get it at the same time. You know, what Cheryl does is very important. And this brother right here, you were talking about, you know, the masses of people. When I spoke earlier, I talked about children and just kind of noticing what they responded to. But this is real important. And since so many of us see slavery as the great turning point, my grandmother always used to tell me, well, now, baby, you know the Underground Railroad was not for everybody. There were some folks who had to wait for the Emancipation Proclamation. And if you lived in Texas, you still didn't know. You know, it took an additional 2 years. So I think that what you have to do is go for the target audience. And one example from my family, Reggie mentioned foreigners. We're both from Detroit. And African Americans from Detroit tend to look at other black people as foreigners. It's true.
We got
It's
Motown.
true.
So.
Yeah, but here's a case in point. My mother was here visiting with me. This was several years ago, and she's kind of grown in terms of leaps and bounds of her appreciation of non-American films. I was trying to get her to see this film, Sugar Cane Alley. Ma, come on, you gotta see it, you gotta see it. Well, what language are they speaking in? I'm like, would you just come on and see it? So one day, she and I were out shopping, you know, I mean, and she had walked and walked and walked. You know, I'm like, I told you to bring some like track shoes or whatever. And we walked past the theater. I said, well, come on, let's go see a movie. She was too tired to ask what it was. She sat there, and she was mesmerized, you know. And then what she said when we got out there, well, why'd you wait so long to take me to see it? But it was really that type of, you know, outreach and intimacy, and she was worn down, and that's the only way I could, well, I don't like films by foreigners. You know, where's Martinique? Is that near the Bahamas? You know, it was kind of like that.
Let me just add a final thing on the distribution thing. Just in terms of definitions, a lot of discussion on the panels have been about African cinema, and I was trying to figure out, or African American cinema. I didn't know if we had one. I know we have African American films and African films, but do we actually have a cinema industry? Mm-hmm. For the most part, 50% of it, I began a dialogue with Manthia Diawara and Ousmane Sembène at the 93, 94 FESPACO, and the issue then that Manthia brought up was that if the relationship, if the cinema houses were nationalized, there might be something that has to happen on France's part in terms of imports of rice or something else, or exports of, you know, in terms of, it's just another thing that has to be dealt with in terms of economics. So we don't control that necessarily. Yet, if we look at the distribution of hip-hop music right? As an example, these films are there. They are out there in a certain way. I was telling Cheryl, I was arguing with one of the filmmakers, Michelle Parkinson, who did the film Audre Lorde. It was a while back ago. I'm not arguing with her now. But we were talking about her films and the fact that from Atlanta to California to Chicago to Detroit, there are programmers like Cheryl, Pearl Bowser, different people who made films like Sankofa run national and make a profit. Okay, that's a defining example of us taking over distribution of our own work. And a lot of these films do make it to libraries and to colleges, but the filmmakers don't see that as being important. If their work reaches 100,000 people, that's not important as if, you know, Spike Lee reached millions. So we have to kind of get up off this mass million thing, all happening at the same time through national broadcast, and we'll see that the films, a lot of African films are distributed through California Newsreel, and they made a deal with a lot of libraries across the country that they would purchase 10 to 20 films at a discount price. So they are there probably in some library. That's our network.
Clyde, can I say one thing about the distribution piece? I just want to mention one other small thing. Some of you all may know that Magic Johnson's gone into the exhibition business with Sony. He has a multiplex in LA that hosted the Pan-African Film Festival that takes place out there. One is being built in Atlanta right now, and we're negotiating. He's been committed in LA to one theater, I think it's 12 theaters, to one being committed to African and African-American independent cinema. And just in terms of the vibe of presenting African films in this big thing that says magic cinema, in terms of building audience in the black community, if he keeps it up, that is going to make a difference. Just the PR value of Magic Johnson saying, here, this theater is for African and African American work.
I just want to add some additional information about Nixon's comment. I was in Paris last month and learned that the South African television had bought 12 African films. The filmmakers were very happy, and I'm sure Nixon is right also. There are some honorable implications as well. And then Canal Original and Sank, the new one, also showing African films in Francophone Africa. So we should pay attention to television. And lastly, for the meeting in Mali organized by Suleiman Tisse, we only look at these conditions for people that films by professionals. So it is the most important issue at this point in time.
I have a question. We always talk about film in this small time market of selling it at a discount, and it not being marketable to the general public. There being some art form that has to be shown in an art house, rather than being viable and profitable, you know, for both the filmmakers and for the community. In my opinion, that we have to start looking at the films that we make, African Americans, whatever, you know, black folks. When I say folks, you understand that from Detroit. Folks there. You gotta look at it, you know, as a $1 million business, as a business. Because if we don't, somebody's going to take over distribution, and they're going to make $1 million of it. And again, tell everybody else, well, you know, it's not marketable. Why don't you put it in this little thing? We have to start making money off of our film. And making money is not a bad thing.
I couldn't agree more. And actually, my point before about the way in which African cinema has entered in the U.S. through the art circuit has been its limitation. That, in essence, the few art cinemas that are left in each city that are looking at French or German or Italian or Japanese will look at for a certain kind of African film, which they feel conforms to whatever aesthetics or whatever. And there are, of course, some that do. But what do you do with the Golden Ball? I mean, it's not a film that belongs in an art house. It's a film that belongs everywhere. What do you do with Keita or many of the films that I think could find really large audiences? And that's been the problem. It's entered in this kind of circuit where, in a sense, it almost guarantees a sort of limited access to many people.
I mean, you know, you say, you mentioned certain African films, then you have stuff like Nep, you know, and then you have other titles that, innocuous titles that, I mean, you know, but it sells. They get awards. You know, these things are awarded by the public. I mean, you have to look at...
I think one thing to what you're saying, I mean, if you look at a way, even take NYU as an example, for every 10,000 people who want to be a director, there's probably one person who wants to do distribution, right? And so we come to a lot of these conferences and talk about the films that don't have distribution, but nobody wants to go to distribution school. When I applied to ITP, I think I liked about it as a possibility was that with digital technology, the possibility that production and distribution could be simultaneous. All right, I don't know if that's going to actually happen, but they do explore in that particular program the idea of distribution of media through cable, through satellite, through other types of things. And yet, at the same time, a lot of students weren't enrolling in those classes. Everybody wanted to produce a CD-ROM or produce some particular piece. And so just like we had this evolution of people wanting to be in front of the camera, then behind the camera, then I think it's kind of a stereotype, but we need to own the cameras and do some other things and have that kind of interest.
I think what I'm hearing is a genre of discussion that I call frustrated idealism. And I can understand both the frustration and the idealism, but I think the two never get together in a practical way, or at least don't always get together in a practical way. But I think one of the things that was said at a conference recently is very important is, one, before we make these pronouncements out of our frustrated idealism, we really ought to check what is being done, and maybe even think what we can really do, as opposed to express our frustration, as well as our idealism. Come, Joe.
I welcome Mr. Pena's comments. I have a unique experience coming into film. I come out of African American theater, and being a native of New York City and being involved in theater coming out of Harlem, going back to Mary Baraka and Larry Neal and those in Harlem and others who I learned theater from, and then seeing films come out and meeting one time, we met with Joseph Papp in Harlem at the Frank Career Writers Workshop in the early 80s, about 1984. We discussed some of these same things that we're discussing here about film. We were discussing about African American theater and seeing certain things happen with grants and so forth and so on. And Mr. Papp, said some things that reflected on his openness to present African American plays at the public theater. But we could not put or look to him as being, as a public theater being a place for African American theater as a sole, venue for it to be showcased. And those of us who were thinking on a more independent level seen that and welcomed his comments, because he has a particular responsibility that at the time, and so does the public theater have today under George Wolfe, in that it has to cater to a diverse community. Okay, so the independence of Mr. Pena's comments again relates back to the responsibility that African American artists and African people have to their own culture. And this question is going to come up constantly and constantly until certain marriages and responsibilities and commitments are made in this whole process. Because it's sad to see. I coordinated the school program for Sankofa here in New York and was the marketing director of group sales marketing. So I've seen over 35,000 young people that seen Sankofa and talked to them and seen how film affected them and how they looked at film as a means of learning and motivating them to learn. And it's incredible that here, a year or two later, I meet teachers who will stop me in the street or someplace and say, you know, Kojo, those students who seen Sankofa, it touched them a certain way. And so that went back to when I went to the Board of Ed and made a presentation about Sankofa. I made a presentation, I broadened it to why couldn't film, period, be used as an educational vehicle in the educational process. And it wasn't just African-American students. I mean, of course, the school system in New York, 70–60% is African-American and Latino. But I mean, there was a couple occasions where we had some, and when you look at multilingual, bilingual classes, you get people from Bangladesh and Honduras and Ecuador and all these places, and they seen Sankofa, and they were moved. They were moved because they seen a history, they seen a story of all these black faces that they seen in their classes who spoke Spanish, who spoke French, who spoke, you know, all different English accents from Trinidad to Antigua and so forth. They seen a story presented to them. And it was fascinating to watch and interact with them to see how this one film opened up so many doors of truth for them. But that's what film can do. So again, it comes back to a certain responsibility there. I met African-American educators who were resistant to Sankofa being showed to the students because this scene, that scene, the rape scene, and this, that, and other. So I think we have to be open to take the responsibility to create the means that's here. Because as long as we keep saying that we got to work and millions of people are not going to see it, they won't see it until, as Clyde said, we attack the very practical possibility that's there from a lot of entities that can be brought to bear, and certain things are being brought right now, the African American Church and so forth, some other institutions, but particularly African American Church. And these other groups, the NAACP right now, is moving into a more of a cultural, educational kind of thing. So I think, you know, this goes back to that whole very basic point, that these films are going to die. I did an interview on television, these things right here that said here, I talked about that. You know, unless we take the responsibility and those of like-mindedness, I don't care what their racial or religious backgrounds are, but if they have a commitment to seeing positive things like this happen, it will happen. Because we got to work. It's a shame that the work, you know, all these beautiful films are not being seen by the world, not just African people, but by everybody who yearns to see the truth.
I think that's a well-taken point from someone who has really done a great deal to promote African-American theater. We have time for only one more comment. That would be yes. That will be our last comment, then we'll hear from you.
It's a very simple and casual problem, but I would like to know what are the roles of festivals in terms of distribution of film. For the past 20 years, the festival has been going to festival, and it doesn't look like there is yet the possibility to create distribution channels for this film. We not asking the question really if this is really the appropriate place to discuss this or elsewhere.
Well, I think there should be some response to the question from Suna, my sister, who's come from Mali and deserves a response. What is the role of festivals in the distribution of African films?
But Cameron.
I would just,
I'm not really quite involved in the film world as such, but Raoul Peck's film, Men at the Shore.
By the Shore.
By the Shore, thank you. I saw it at the Human Rights Film Festival.
And it's going to open May 10th.
May 18th.
18th, all right.
you're even.
My impression was that he was tired. He did a lot of the festivals, and he was tired of doing the festivals. And he sat on the film for a while when he was approached by other people, except for fundraisers and things like that, because he waited for distribution. And you were tired to get it distributed.
I think that my own personal feeling is I understand the frustration of filmmakers, particularly filmmakers who have shot films in 35 millimeter, films that may have cost $4 million or more, magnificent films that win grand international prizes, and they can only be seen in festivals. But I'm afraid my own response is, the only thing I can do is festival related. I cannot do the theatrical distribution thing, myself. And all I can do is what can be done through this kind of venue, because that's who I am. A camera, I see.
Yeah, I just wanted to address that question as well. I also program for Festive, Toronto Film Festival. And there is such a thing as a festive film, not just an African festival. There are films whose only distribution is through their international festivals. I think the problem is that that's the case for almost all African films. And that is the distribution. We don't have distribution. And I think I actually do feel like festivals have some responsibility for doing whatever we can to get those films into distribution, because we benefit from having those films in our festivals, obviously. It's not something where we're doing the filmmakers a favor by showing their films. It's something where we're also gaining something for our audiences and for the prestige of the festival, as people call it. So, as hard as it is, I actually do feel like it's sort of incumbent upon the festivals to try and make connections with filmmakers.
Clyde, can I
Finit
say...
Sawadoga, the director of FESPACO.
Merci. Enfin, moi, j'aimerais simplement dire non, je voudrais simplement dire que de plus en plus, à cause de l'absence de structure de l'industrie cinématographique en Afrique, on s'adosse un peu trop au festival et on se rend compte que les festivals ont des limites.
Because of the very lack of distribution challenge in Africa, perhaps we rely more and more on festivals without really looking at the fact that festivals themselves have limitations.
Parce que la fonction première d'un festival, c'est de montrer des films, on les prend et on en fait ce qu'on veut.
The very objective of festivals is to show films and make them into whatever you want.
Mais bien évidemment, à cause de ces lacunes, finalement nous tournons en rond et je pense qu'effectivement c'est le moment de penser que le cinéma c'est pas uniquement les festivals et les universitaires qui en parlent.
Because of those misgivings, we should not lose the fact that cinema is not only for festivals, they're also getting some platforms.
Et je pense que le rôle premier d'un festival, c'est de permettre que 40 personnes très importantes et un panel de connaisseurs puissent justement théoriser sur le cinéma.
And yes, it is also the role of a festival to permit 40 trillion folks in the panel of scholars needed to theorize that.
Je voudrais enfin dire, puisque nous ne traitons plus du panel de ce soir, je veux revenir au panel de ce soir en disant que ce matin, j'ai rencontré quelqu'un qui disait que l'un des plus grands acteurs américains ne voulait plus que des Français doublent
son dialogue. It's we go a little bit beyond the rims of the festival, and I like to have the conversation I had this morning with an American actor that say that
je disais que ce matin, l'acteur Eddie Murphy ne voulait pas que les Européens français doublent sa voix sur ses films. Il préférait que ce soit Maître Hondo, qui est quelqu'un que vous connaissez, qui puisse doubler ses films en français. C'est donc dire que le pont qu'on peut jeter entre ces deux cultures, les cultures africaines, américaines et les films africains, ce sont les accents. Et l'accent, c'est notre culture et c'est ça qui nous réunit.
I think we have to now close with an announcement from Don. But before we do that, I want to thank the panelists and the audience and all the contributors. Last word. You get the last word, Cecil. No, it's fine.
My goodness.
I have to say that I didn't get any satisfactory reply on my question. I have to say it. It is not because I'm deceived to be with you, on the contrary. And I really believe about the light that is shed in this debate in the future. It's an existential question. And it's not camouflage. That you're talking about is the industry. The industry exists in this country. There are festivals in this country. There is hope here. These films I've never seen in this country. So the problem maybe resides somewhere else. We have to together look for a solution.
Let me just, I think it's, Suleiman's point is really important. And the idea is that a festival is not a marketplace, all right? The idea that was that FESPACO was going to be a marketplace, all right? And we have a number of film festivals which act as markets, where buyers come. I mean, this shouldn't even be a guess of what's supposed to happen at these places. Buyers from Germany, from Japan, from London, all over, from television and film buyers are supposed to come to a market and buy the work. At the one FESPACO that I went to, I had talked to a couple African-American distributors, and we had talked about spending the year getting buyers to come to that place, the Georges Méliès Film Center, where all the distributors were supposed to come and make sure they buy something. We weren't successful, but the idea is that a festival is not a market, and it needs to be a marketplace. All right, so your concerns are right on the money, and we need to make FESPACO a marketplace for African cinema in the very near future.
Last word.
Ted Turner will buy the catalog when he's good and ready. So you guys have got to get your catalog together, you work together so that when they come to buy your stuff for the 700 channel global satellites, you can have some kind of an agreement together.
Oh, we'll have a catalog. That's not a problem.
I just wanted to give a final note of thanks to Manthia Diawara and all the effort and energy he's put behind us in making this festival a success and making this panel possible by putting the resources of NYU at our disposal, and not only Manthia, but the entire Department of Africana Studies, including Glenda and Tanya and Fatima and everyone that has taken time out to try and make this program a success. So once again, thank you all for coming out. Please go and see the rest of the films in the series. There are also films at Brooklyn Museum next month, and thank you once again, and we have food and refreshments in the back. Please partake and carry on these discussions informally for the next hour or so.
In this movie called Miriam, and this woman got up with her grandchildren and like, the movie was over, and they all smiled.